Great. Hi, evening, everyone. My name's Alicia Kennedy, and I'm the Director of Generation Rent. Welcome to the first of this week's webinar for Renters' Rights Awareness Week. This webinar is themed affording your rent. And we hope to give you information and advice for those private renters who are currently struggling with rent debt. We've got two excellent speakers tonight, and I'm going to introduce them. The first is Jamie Thunder, who's the Policy and Public Affairs Officer for Z2K. Now, for those who don't know Z2K, get to know Z2K. They're a very well-respected, effective anti-poverty charity. And Jamie, before joining Z2K, was a debt advisor who helped families on low incomes navigate the welfare system. So we're very pleased to have Jamie to talk to us tonight. And then Dan Wilson-Craw, who's the Deputy Director of Generation Rent. And he leads on our policy and research and all things Renters Reform Bill. Generation Rent, as you know, is a campaign and advocacy organisation, and our mission is to ensure that every home in the private rented sector is safe, secure and affordable. So Jamie and Dan have got quick presentations to give you the information we feel that you need as private renters to afford your rent and help you through this winter cost of living crisis. As they present, please use the chat for comments or questions. Now, if you use the chat, people can see what you say. So if you want just the panel and the host to see your question, then use the Q&A function. And we'll let Jamie and Dan run through their presentations and then open it up to questions and answer your questions and comments. And this should last no longer than an hour. And at the end, I'll obviously do some closing remarks about fact sheets and how you can get involved with Generation Rent. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jamie from Z2K.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you to Generation Rent for inviting Z2K to speak, and to Alicia for that introduction. I'm just going to try to share my screen, so bear with me. We are some years into a working from home situation, so hopefully I've managed that. That looks like it's showing up. Yep, I've got a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay. So for those of you who that's good. I thought I'd done that for a moment. Right, now, for those of you who don't know Z2K, we're an anti-poverty charity based in London, as Alicia said, and we work directly with clients to help them resolve their benefit and housing issues, and we use the insights from that to campaign for local and national change. Now, I've been given the task of talking about what you can do if you're struggling with your rent. I've only got 10 minutes, so I will go quite quickly through these slides, but they will be available afterwards as well. There aren't any silver bullets in here, but hopefully there are some useful and helpful ideas and suggestions. So first of all, I'll very quickly run through the support that's been delivered or announced so far. I'm pleased to say none of these have been affected by any recent statements. We've had the £150 council tax rebate, the £650 to people receiving means-tested benefits, an additional £300 to anyone receiving disability benefits, and £400 to every household between October and March, which will be in 6 instalments of £66.67. But then a month, I should say. Now, there might be various other things that you are entitled to, and if keeping up with your rent is proving a challenge, it is worth seeing if any of these might apply. Now, you've probably heard of universal credit, which is the first thing I'll talk about. If you've got less than £16,000 in savings, either individually or as a couple, it's worth a quick check to see if you are entitled to anything, because there's no upper earnings limit. The way that it works is the DWP works out your sort of initial entitlement, and then that gets chipped away as you work. But if that initial entitlement is very high, maybe you're renting in somewhere with very high rents, like lots of London, including the part where I'm renting, and if you've got children, that initial amount can be quite high, so you can get quite a way up the income scale before that goes down to zero. As well as being a bit of direct financial help that can entitle you to other help like free school meals or support with NHS costs, so particularly prescriptions, dentistry and opticians. Now, if you've got the other main thing I want to talk about in this slide is PIP, or personal independence payment. Now, if you've got a health condition or a disability that affects you day to day, whether that's mental or physical, you might be entitled to some amount of personal independence payment, and that amount can vary depending on how much your condition affects you in different ways. It's not linked to what condition you've got, it's linked to how it affects you. That can be between about £25 a week at the absolute minimum, up to about £150 a week for people whose health really does affect them quite substantially. That's not means tested, and it can make a really big difference. Doesn't matter what savings you've got, doesn't matter what income you earn. The one thing I would say is it can take quite a long time to get an initial decision from DWP. It's currently about 4 months from putting in the initial application to the DWP saying what they are going to, what they think you should get. So it's not a quick fix. It's also worth saying that if you have good reason to think that you are entitled to something and they either give you less than you thought or don't give you anything at all, quite a lot of people win if they challenge it. So that's also worth being aware of. You can first of all ask DWP to look at it again themselves. And if they still won't, you can go to an independent, free and not particularly scary tribunal as well. And lots of people who are turned down at first win if they go there. So that's PIP. I'll talk very briefly about council tax support, which isn't money in your pocket, but it does reduce your council tax bill. And so that can free up money for other things. The other three benefits I've got on here are a bit more niche, a little bit less common these days. So I won't go into lots of detail about them. These slides will go around, as I say, and I can answer questions about them if people want to. But one thing I'd say is if you're currently getting income-based employment support allowance, it's worth checking that you've been getting everything that you should have, because quite a lot of people have been missing out because of DWP mistakes, or certain amounts or certain premiums, certain elements that can make up that award, and you can be entitled to get all of those sort of paid back potentially over several years. So that can be quite a good amount of money. So if you're currently getting income-based ESA, it's worth speaking to a specialist benefits advisor just to see if there might be scope for there to be something else that you should have been getting potentially for quite a long time. So that's some ways that you might be able to increase what you've got coming in. I'm not going to talk about other sort of maybe obvious ways, like if you can try and work more hours or that sort of thing. But also, where it's possible, reducing your spending can obviously help you afford your rent. Now, I'm under no illusions. I was a debt advisor for a number of years. Probably most of you on this Zoom call are already doing all of these things. So they're always worth mentioning is the way I see it. Now, the first thing a former debt advisor would normally put here, and for most of the time I was an advisor this was true, was switch your energy provider, but that's not a lot of use at the moment. You can, however, see if there are, and these aren't the biggest savings, but they add up. If you can get a better deal on your broadband or on your phone, and if you get certain benefits, you might be able to get discounts on these as well. Those aren't sort of formal statutory legal schemes, but they are things that a lot of especially larger providers offer. And you can also get discounts on your water bill. So water companies around the country offer slightly different types of help with bills if you're on a low income. The link I've put there should give you information that applies wherever you are in the country. I know with Thames Water in London, that would basically chop your bill in half. But that will differ a little bit, I think, by different water companies around the country. And if you've got a water meter, so you pay for what you use, and either a big family or health conditions that mean that you use a lot of water, maybe you need to take a lot of showers, there's a national scheme called Water Sure that can also cap your water bill. I mentioned council tax support earlier. Councils have also got the discretion to reduce or write off council tax arrears or reduce your current year's bill if you just can't pay. Now, that's at their discretion, so it's not guaranteed, but there's no harm in applying for it either. And finally, it's always a good idea to keep a track of your spending, just in case there are things that you didn't realize were adding up so much. It might not tell you anything that you don't already know, but there might be bits that you realize, oh, hang on, actually, now I can see that I'm spending a lot here. So there's a link there to a tool you can use there. Increasing numbers of apps, banking apps now also have ways that sort of divvy up your spending a bit as well. So it's worth taking a bit of time to see what your bank offers in terms of, ways to help you work out what's going out and what it's going out on. So hopefully those are useful tips, whether or not you're currently behind with your rent. But if things do get difficult, then here are some things you can look at there. And the first one is to, if you feel able to, talk to your landlord. Now, and ideally do that at an earlier stage. Now, that might be scary, and I appreciate that. I wouldn't want to talk to my landlord about that either. But it is, if you think about it from their perspective, it's probably better that they know that, that you're having a difficult time than they suddenly see a reduced payment go into their account 1 month, because that's a nasty shock. And at least if you talk to them up front, then they know that you're not ignoring the whole thing. Councils have also got money that they can use to help with rent arrears. These are called discretionary housing payments. They'll often want you to show that you can keep up with your rent in the future. So, they're not going to be throwing good money after bad. They have got a limited pot of money. That's limited in law as well. Having said that, DHPs can be really, really useful for some people. So it's definitely worth looking at that as well. They can also help you pay arrears, undo things like the bedroom tax or the benefit cap for a limited period of time. Or they can help you move to more affordable accommodation. If your circumstances have changed and you just can't afford where you are now, but you can't afford a moving van, that's another purpose that those can be put to. Particularly if you're in employment or have been in employment in certain sectors, there can be charitable funds that can help, and they can sometimes be incredibly generous as well. It's well worth looking on Turn to Us to see what's available there. That's not normally specific to housing, but that can absolutely help with those costs. And councils have also got general sort of support funds, but the amounts there, I should say, are normally pretty low that they'll offer you. In my experience, they're normally 100 quid at most. You're not talking about large amounts, whereas charitable funds and DHPs sometimes can be quite substantial. Now, as a former debt advisor, it'd be wrong of me not to talk briefly about debt advice, and this can especially help if one reason you're struggling with your rent is that you've got other debt repayments that you're making. But make sure it's free and independent advice from a charity, because there's lots of organisations out there that want to push you towards a particular option called an IVA, or an individual voluntary arrangement, which might not be right for you. And indeed, if you are renting, it is almost certainly not right for you, because one of the big benefits is that you can get it if you own property, and it doesn't put that property at risk, unlike bankruptcy, for example. And finally, if things get really serious and you need specialist help, there are lots of different types of organisations that can give free and independent advice. I've listed and linked to various different types of organisation on this slide, and they might be able to help you stay in the property and speak to your landlord, or if that's not going to be possible, they can at least give you advice about what to do if you can't. And if you are in London and receiving means tested benefits, please feel free to contact Z2K. And we will do what we can. We do not always have capacity to take on new cases, but if we don't, then we will do our best to direct you to somewhere that will as well. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jamie. And there's a few comments going in the Q&A in the chat, so people can do that, and then we'll open it to questions after Dan. Thank you, Jamie. That was excellent. I learnt a lot. Dan, over to you.
Right, I'm off mute now. Yep. Right, if you can see my screen, I'm going to talk about what you can do if your landlord wants a higher rent. Now, last year we did this. Rents had been subdued quite a lot by the pandemic, so this wasn't such a big problem. In the past year, rents on new tenancies have gone up, probably over the past 12 months, and a lot of tenants are experiencing this. Their landlord coming to them saying, "I want often a ridiculous amount more rent per month." So it can be very scary figures. As to echo what Jamie said at the start of his presentation, there's no silver bullets here, but there's a lot of things that are useful to know if you're in this position. So the first thing to know is that your landlord can't simply raise your rent. So there's only a few ways they can do this. Either they have to get you to agree to it. They can do it, serve you a formal notice, or they can get you to move out, get a new tenant in. So the things you can do to actually agree to a new rent is to in your initial tenancy agreement, it might have something in there, a clause that says the rent will go up by a certain amount every year. So that's something to check if your landlord's asking for a higher rent. Have you signed up to this? You will also technically agree to a new rent if you sign a new fixed term agreement. So your initial 12 months come to an end. The landlord says, "I will renew your tenancy at this new higher rent," and if you sign that, then that's you agreeing to that rent. You don't have to sign a new fixed term tenancy. If you don't move out at the end of a fixed term, then your tenancy simply rolls on. It becomes a rolling tenancy, or what's called a statutory periodic tenancy. So there's no fixed term. You can give notice at any time. You can give your landlord 1 month's notice, but your landlord can also give you 2 months notice to move out. You can also simply start paying a new rent. So even if you didn't sign something, that also counts as as agreement. So that bear those things in mind. So if your landlord says, "I'm raising the rent," you can respond and say, "Actually, I disagree." What they can do is serve what's called a Section 13 notice. This is a formal notice of raising the rent. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. But that's something that it's restricted in terms of what they can do. They can only do it once a year, only outside a fixed term, so during a rolling tenancy. And you can then take them to a tribunal to challenge the rent. And then after you move out, this is unfortunately, this is the landlord's trump card. So if you disagree with a rent increase, they can serve a Section 21 notice and force you to move out. They'll get a new tenant who will pay the rent, or may pay the rent that they want. But that's just something, obviously, to bear in mind. First thing to think about, it can feel quite shocking to see, a landlord demanding a much higher rent. But it's important to remember that you might have a few advantages that you could bring to this conversation. So you could, first of all, have you been a reliable tenant? What will happen if you move out? Well, the landlord have to, put the property up for rent again. They'll get a new tenant in who they don't know. How do they know that new tenant is going to be reliable? So you can talk. If you've been if you stuck to your tenancy agreement, that's quite a strong thing that you can take to the landlord and say, this is a risk to you if you lose me as a tenant. It's also worth thinking about whether you can afford it. If you can simply say to the landlord, "This is too much. I can't afford this." The landlord could say, "Oh, okay. I thought I was, putting something up putting the rent at a reasonable rate. But if you generally can't afford it, that's something that could alter what the landlord thinks about the whole request. It's also important to find out whether the landlord's being realistic in terms of what they could get in the local market. So look at Rightmove, Spare Room, Zoopla, local letting agents. What are properties that are similar size to yours being advertised for locally? If it's much higher, if it's the same level that the landlord's asking for, then that's bad news. Unfortunately, the landlord's probably in a strong position to be able to let that property out, let your property out at the rent they want. But if there are local properties that they're going for a much lower rent or a lower rent, then it's really worth highlighting that to your landlord, because they might then kind of realize that they're being that if they'll have to if they lose you as a tenant, they'll have to maybe take a hit in terms of the rent they can actually get. It's also worth thinking about what you get for your rent. So if you've been raising repairs issues with your landlord, they haven't fixed them, this is the time where you need to say, well, you might get a higher rent from me, but are you going to actually fix these problems? Are you going to make improvements? There could be a deal to be made. So, for example, if your home's hard to heat in the winter, and obviously energy costs are much higher now, there's potential for asking the landlord to use that extra money they're getting from you to invest in the property and make it a better place to live in. That's obviously if you can afford to pay that rent in the first place. It's also worth finding out if your landlord's being advised to raise the rent to a high level by the letting agent. The letting agent and the landlord aren't always going to have the same kind of motivations. Letting agents are often behind a very high rent increase because they get a commission from a higher rent. So whereas the landlords might be more inclined to keep hold of a good tenant. So where possible, it's always worth trying to speak directly to the landlord rather than going through the letting agent. If you can find your landlord's contact details, then that's helpful, and you can request your landlord's address by law. So obviously, you say all this to the landlords. You have to wait for their response. That can be quite a daunting prospect. But there are a few things that the landlord could come back with. So they could say, okay, what rent would you pay? What increase would you pay? And sometimes that's you could say, well, my wages have gone up by this percentage. This is what I think is reasonable. They might accept that. They might simply say, okay, I'll offer you a lower rent increase. If they do that, then get that agreed in writing. It might involve signing a new tenancy agreement for a fixed term. They could just turn around and say, okay, I'm going to serve you a formal Section 13 notice. So that could be challenged at a tribunal, as I mentioned. I'll come to that on the next slide. And then the potentially the worst outcome of there would be receiving a Section 21, which is the no fault eviction notice to quit. But it's always worth, if you do get one, checking if it is valid, because if your deposit's not protected or the landlord's charged an illegal fee, or indeed haven't, there are a number of things that they could charge you which is illegal. So one of the big problems with that we've seen since the Tenant Fees Act a few years ago is landlords charging holding deposits that are then not taken off the rent or the deposit. So it's worth checking if you're in that position. Similarly, there's various safety and compliance documentation that landlords need to have. So gas safety, energy performance certificate, how to rent guide. If you haven't got any of those, or if you haven't got one of those, then Section 21 notice is invalid. And then if your home's in a particularly bad condition and the council actually been in and served an improvement notice or other type of enforcement notice that the landlord hasn't dealt with, then that's then you're potentially protected from a Section 21 as well. And then this only applies to a minority of homes, but only about 7% of private rented homes need a license. But and it's normally shared houses that are more likely to need a license. But it's worth checking if your home is licensed correctly. That's done through the local council. So my final slide just touches on the first tier tribunal, which is where you can get a market rent assessment done if you're served with a Section 13 notice. These are done, you'll basically be asked to provide reasons why you think the rent shouldn't be as high as the landlord has asked for. One of the things that's really important to think about is the quality of the home. Do you think that this is a decent, of a decent standard that could fetch what the what the market rent would be? Unfortunately, one of the problems with the tribunal is that it bases the rent on what homes are going for in the market right now, which are at present, at this particular moment in time, rents are very expensive. So it's something to bear in mind. But if your home's of poor quality, then you've got a better chance of getting a lower sort of reduction of the rent, or at least of the rent increase from the tribunal. It's worth considering that the tribunal could actually award the landlord a higher rent than they asked for. So they could ask for less than what the market rent is, but then the tribunal could actually sort of make you pay even more. So another thing is if you get if you apply for this, then it could you could be asked to pay from the new rent from the day the notice was served. So you might have to start putting money aside so that you can actually pay that if you do have to pay what the landlord's asked for. One thing that's really useful to know is that all market rent assessments are published online with that link. So that's can give you an idea about what's achievable, what isn't. That's it from me.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And Dan, there's a couple of questions. There's a question in the Q&A about insulating and heating, and a couple in the chat I'll let you look at. But there's been quite a few on DHP, which I'm going to start with Jamie. I think that will be the DHP. So, Jamie, on DHP, the questions are: how easy is it? What's the process? And is every council's process different? How do you prove that you can pay the rent in the future? And are there different criteria in different local authorities? And finally, if people are nervous about speaking to their landlord, do they have to have gone through a landlord negotiation before they can apply for DHP?
Okay, thank you, Alicia, and to those who've asked questions about DHPs. I'm going to, I'll try and cover all those. If I miss any out as I'm talking, Alicia, do tell me at the end, that because I won't deliberately miss any out. So DHPs, each council has their own form, but the process is pretty similar. So you'll need to find the form. It's usually on their website. Sometimes it's an online form you can do through a browser. Sometimes it's a PDF that you've got to print out or get someone to print for you, fill it out, either post it or scan it in. It's usually quite detailed. It'll ask you lots of questions, but don't be overwhelmed by it. If that does feel a bit overwhelming, or if you just want some some help with it, go to your local advice agency, whether that's benefits advice or debt advice. A debt advisor I certainly filled out plenty of those in my time as a debt specific advisor, but benefits advisors can do it as well. There's no simple answer as to how easy it is to get the DHP sort of award. The stronger the case that you can make, the better. That's a good point there from somebody in the chat as well, that councils also have their own many have their own welfare team who can help with that as well. Not necessarily all, but it's a good point. So yeah, the stronger the case you can make, the better for why, how the problems built up, what's happened that means that you need this support. And similarly, the stronger case you can make for why you're not likely to need that support in the future. You're looking to go back to work. Maybe you've got an active application for personal independence payment in the pipeline that will give you extra money, but you're currently just waiting for the outcome of that. You're more likely generally to be successful if you've already been served a notice of seeking possession, because councils really do have limited funds. It's limited by the government what they can give out in DHP money. So sort of the worse things are, the more of a chance you've got. Also, if you have been paying all of any housing benefit or housing part of universal credit to the landlord, and yeah, if you can show a way for how you'll keep up in the future. A landlord negotiation process. Most of these forms will have a box that will say, have you spoken to your landlord about reducing the rent? If there's nothing formal you have to do, there's no formal evidence you have to give to show that you've done that. So the simple answer is no, you don't need to. In practice, you may need to tick a box to say that you have, but you may also know from experience that your landlord is not particularly receptive to that sort of thing. You don't need to specifically raise it with your landlord necessarily that you're doing this, although it can be quite a good idea because it shows that you're not ignoring the problem and you are trying to do something about it. If you're applying for help with arrears, the council probably is going to want an up-to-date rent statement, so proof of those arrears. So you might have to engage or have someone engage on your behalf with the landlord or the letting agent to evidence that. If you're just applying for help with your ongoing rent, then your tenancy agreement should be enough. So as long as you've still got a copy of that, you shouldn't need to do that. Do different councils have different criteria for DHPs? Not specifically to my knowledge, but they will all make their own decisions. So if you know someone in one council whose circumstances are very similar to yours, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to get it. It's not a tick box, does this person qualify or not? It does depend on, it's things as simple as how much money does the council have left. Is it currently on track to wildly overspend on DHPs and run out by the end of December, or is it going to be okay going through to April when there will be a new pot of money, in which case you might have a bit more luck. So there is a little bit of a council lottery there. Has that answered all the questions, Alicia?
It has, Jamie. Thank you. I think so. And if people think no, then please put them back in the chat or the Q&A. Jamie, I'm going to go on to Dan, but while we're moving on to the questions to Dan, you can think about, there's a question in the Q&A about students and help and also universal credit. Has anything changed? I didn't used to be able to get it, but now I can. And breathing space, what is that and how does it affect me? Dan, I don't know if you've seen the question in Q&A about insulation and heating. Are there obligations on landlords in terms of what's been adequate to save tenants costs and the mechanisms that you mentioned? You just want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so landlords currently are obliged to make sure all the homes that they let out are have an energy performance certificate with a rating of A to E. The two lowest ratings are F and G, and they are illegal in a private rented home. So that came in a few years ago, 2019, 2020. The councils are required to council have the power to enforce that, fine landlords if they are renting out homes with an F or G. Unfortunately for the tenant, there's not much you can do to compel your landlord to do that, and there aren't any formal protections in terms of Section 21. It would probably count towards, if you went to the tribunal would probably take that into account if your home was not energy efficient, in terms of what rent the landlord could charge. And it's also worth saying that having a poorly insulated home means that you're at higher risk of mold and damp and excessive cold conditions, which are basically what are described as hazards under the other part of housing regulation. So your council can come in and do an inspection if they find that it's mouldy or damp. If you're living in an excessively cold property, they can serve an improvement notice, and that will then protect you from a Section 21 that lasts for 6 months. If you have if your property has an improvement notice against it, and so even if the works are done in that period of time, which I know was raised in another question, it lasts that protection lasts for 6 months. I did notice there's another question around Section 21 protections, which basically the question was, let me see if I can find it to give it justice.
Is it the one about an improvement notice? If a council issued an improvement notice and or the property does not have a licence, is the Section 21 only not valid while works are being done and the licence is obtained? I.e., could you get served one as soon as that's over?
So in terms of improvement notices, the protection lasts for 6 months. In terms of licenses, the protection lasts as long as the property is not licensed. So I think if I'll check this and just make sure we've got exactly the right advice on this, and make sure that our website's up to date. But there are a few different things that could happen. So a landlord could serve a Section 21 notice while they don't have a license and then apply for a license. And by the time that the court maybe considers that eviction, maybe they do have a license, and that's what I'm not entirely clear on, whether that's possible. I'll go away and check that. But that's it's a really good question.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And then one about increase. There's one person has put that their residential fee has been put up as well as the rent, but obviously you can't necessarily comment on that specific, but there's rules against fees, is there not?
Yes, I'm not entirely clear what kind of tenancy this is, because the Tenant Fees Act applies to anyone renting for a private landlord, and it basically bans any type of fee except very specific types that are generally if a tenant has paid rent late, if they're breaking the contract early. Those are the only other extra things that the landlord can charge for, unless it is rent or some kind of deposit which is refundable. So a residential fee is not something I'm familiar with. I know that in the social sector there are certain types of additional charge which are sometimes charged, and I think fall outside of the Tenant Fees Act. It sounds to me if you're a private renter and you're being charged a residential fee or anything else that sounds like it's just a top up on the rent, and then I would, well, please tell Generation Rent about it, because that's something that we want to understand. But that, yeah, that's something to really question, because that could be an illegal fee. It's hard to know from the details provided though.
Okay, and Dan, it's just a little aside on the question. Is the 6 months Section 21 protection from when the works begin or when they're completed, or is that what you need to go in?
Yeah, I see. So 6 months protection from when the improvement notice is served by the council. So it doesn't make a difference as to when the landlord starts doing the work. It's just if the council comes in, does an inspection, and the yeah. So my understanding is that as soon as the council serves an improvement notice, that the landlord, either an existing Section 21 notice is invalid, or the landlord just can't serve a Section 21 notice within that 6 months.
Oh, I'm on mute. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Okay, Jamie, moving over to you. I know you can see the Q&A. So the first one is, what help can I get if I'm a student working once in a while and have high cost of living?
Yes, the simple answer is that's going to depend a lot on your specific circumstances, so the nature of your course, the nature of any student finance you're getting, and the nature of and amount of your work. And so the best thing to do, there might well be things you're entitled to. You might well be entitled to some universal credit, for example. The best thing to do is to speak to, again, an advisor. That could be somewhere like a local citizens advice, but actually your institution is very likely to have welfare and or sort of finance officers who are going to know the rules around students more specifically. So I'd really encourage you to speak to them about it, because they're going to be the experts on that sort of situation. There was also, just briefly, I want to just pick up a couple of points I spotted about DHPs. One that I forgot to say was that there's no formal right to appeal a DHP decision. You can ask because it's discretionary, that's what the D is. You can ask the council to look at it again, and they might, and occasionally they do change their minds, but there's no formal right of appeal. And if they say no after they've reviewed it again, you're out of road there. However, someone's pointed out in the chat quite rightly, you can apply more than once for a DHP. I've never heard of anyone being awarded two in a financial year. I don't think there's any particular reason it can't happen. It just doesn't much in my experience. But yes, particularly maybe if you were declined once, but something has changed that strengthens your application, it could be a good idea to do it again. There's nothing stopping you doing it again. Right, the next question was about if anything's changed with universal credit in the last year, and the answer is yes. That is what is called the taper rate. So I mentioned earlier that basically the way it's calculated is to calculate your sort of original entitlement and then chip it away as you earn more, and eventually to zero. The rate at which it's chipped away was reduced. I can't remember exactly when, actually, but it's within the last year, certainly. And that has the effect of meaning that, not only do you, as you're earning, you keep a bit more of that, or your income goes up by a little bit more than it did previously. It also means that the point at which that reaches zero is a little bit further away. So yes, if you have looked in the past and nothing's changed in your circumstances, it's worth having a look again. For what it's worth, if I were single and didn't have savings, I would be eligible because I live in London, and the reference rent in my area is pretty high. I would be eligible for a reasonable amount of universal credit despite working full time. So it can be done. And then breathing space. Alyssa, you mentioned breathing space. So yeah, breathing space is a relatively new, it's about 18 months old now, scheme that came in England and Wales. There are two types. I'm going to mostly focus on what's called the standard breathing space. There is also what's called a mental health crisis breathing space, but that is for if you're really in a crisis, by which, I mean, the precise details of it have always been a little hazy, really, but you need to be getting very specialist, quite urgent care. And the main difference is, for the purposes of what I'm about to talk about, is that one is open-ended until 30 days after the end of that urgent care. So that could be it might be that you've been sectioned, it might be that you're receiving inpatient care somewhere. Those sorts of, it's quite a high bar to clear. The standard breathing space, so what breathing space does is it puts a pause on what any of your creditors can do, specifically to try to recover money from you, and that includes a landlord. But there's quite an important caveat when it comes to renting. Now, what breathing space does is it means that for up to 60 days, your landlord cannot, or I'm just going to talk about landlords, but it applies to your credit card company as well and whoever else. They can't take action to recover a debt. They are not supposed to write to you, to call you, to text you, and they can't progress eviction proceedings if they are on grounds that specifically relate to rent arrears. So Section 8, I think, is the most common one that's relevant to that. That is a 60-day pause. At the end of that 60 days, they can start again. And frankly, within that 60 days, you're gonna, if your landlord, there's not a huge amount of teeth to this law. So your landlord might still call you, they might still write to you, and there is not a great deal that can be done if they're going to do that. They are breaking the law, but it's very difficult to enforce that. Courts, however, any sort of formal proceedings will obviously know about the breathing space, and to get into the breathing space, you can have one every 12 months, and there are particular criteria that are fairly easy normally to sort of pass. Only a debt advisor can put you into a breathing space, and they sort of manage your breathing space for that 60-day period. There's nothing in law that says that you have to be getting debt advice as part of that. You can just talk to a debt advisor, and if they agree that you qualify, they can put you in. But some agencies might say, we're not just going to administer a breathing space for you. We are debt advisors. We want to give you debt advice as well. So different agencies might have particular things they want you to jump through. So the important thing to know is that breathing space is only temporary. It can give you time to make a plan. It can give you time to wait for a DHP application to come back, for example. Those are useful ways to use it. It can put a pause on things like eviction proceedings as well, which can give you time to make another plan, work out what you're going to do. But it does nothing with a Section 21 notice. Even if you know that even if your landlord has said that the reason that they're issuing the Section 21 notice is rent arrears, because Section 21 is not a rent arrears specific ground, breathing space won't do anything at all. You might be lucky and come across a letting agent or a landlord who thinks it does, but it doesn't in law. So if they want to continue, they can. Great,
thanks, Jamie. Dan, can you look at the Q&A about lodgers while Jamie and maybe Jamie come in back from the other question? So the other question in the Q&A is, what about police officers who are also using food banks and struggling with rent? And how can we assist the Police Federation of England and Wales? And I completely agree. It's, the amount of public sector workers that are now, people in work that are now relying on food banks is, a stain on our country. And I think if you've got contacts with any organisation, including the Police Federation, we're very happy to run events like this for any of their members, organisations, the Police Fed, all trade unions, or anyone who wants to get some renters' rights advice like the type that Jamie and Dan are giving you today, and we'll happily do that. I don't know if Jamie's got anything to add on that specifically about food bank use.
Not specifically. I was just going to ask. I wasn't quite clear from the question whether it's. I think you're right, Alicia, with how you've interpreted it, which is how can we assist police officers? This wasn't. I don't think this was a message posted by somebody from the Police Federation. So yeah, I'm just doing a quick bit of research. while Dan answers the next question about whether there are particular trust funds or benevolent funds that might be good for police officers.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Dan, the question is, how a lodger, in brackets, lodger agreements signed by both sides, living in with the landlord, can react in case of a price increase in renting?
I think clearly there's a lot of people living in a lodger arrangement. I think it might be a rent increase prior to now might have been quite rare, because you tend to be in a quite a you'll see the landlord every day, and normally have quite a good relation in terms of being able to talk about things like that. Clearly, with mortgage rates going up, suddenly living landlords are potentially facing quite a big increase in their outgoings, so might be under more pressures to ask for more rent. Now, I suspect that that there'll be things to do. Having a conversation, talking about the same principles as I outlined a bit earlier, will be helpful. It's also worth checking what you're entitled to through benefits, whether your local housing allowance, if that might provide some more to cover a rent increase. Unfortunately, at the moment, local housing allowance has been frozen since 2020, so for a lot of people it'll be there'll be limited sort of extra support there. Lodgers tend to have limited rights. I don't think that there'll be an opportunity to go to the tribunal, for example. And again, there's no formal sort of system of evictions and protections from eviction. So lodgers are in quite a vulnerable situation in that regard. It can be. It is a lot more challenging. I think if you're in a difficult position as a lodger, you can approach your council, who may be able to help rehouse you if it's coming to that, or other sources of housing advice like shelter or assistance advice.
Great, thanks, Dan. Anything further from you, Jamie, on the question about the police fed? Did your research recoup?
A bit. It looks like there are quite a few benevolent funds that are specific to particular forces or groups of forces. So it's well worth looking at those. Those will differ as to whether they give out direct financial assistance or sort of assistance in kind. It looks like that's going to vary place to place. Also worth saying that Unison, which is the union that police officers may well be a part of, as sort of the biggest, I think, public sector union, does have a financial assistance scheme as well. If you're a paid up member for, I think, at least 4 weeks, it's a fairly minimal hoop to jump through, if you like. So those are all things that, if a police officer came to me, a serving police officer came to me, that I'd be looking at and thinking about. And if you're not a police officer, but that's a cause you want to support, those could be really good places to support yourself as well.
Great, thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Dan. While Dan just puts up the final end slide, I just want to. There's one comment on the chat about the Ukrainian families whose their status is coming to an end with the current family. And yes, we have seen the rise in homeless amongst Ukrainian families. And we're working with an organisation called Opera, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and sent them fact sheets and rights information, and we'll do anything we can to support them. I don't know if Jamie had anything particular to say anything about Ukrainian families, only that we're support them, we want to help them. And if anyone's got any contacts directly with them and they need advice, then please do put them in touch with us. But as I say, we're working with a national organisation. So just to end, I just want to thank you for your time and spending the hour with us. And of course, thanks to Jamie and Dan for their expert advice and support. This is just a final slide to say, if you want to get involved with Generation Rent, please stay in touch. Follow us on social media. You can see we've got Twitter, Facebook, and of course, Instagram. And we're always looking for to hear your experiences of renting. That's because it helps shape our policy and direct our campaigns. So if you've got an experience to share, you can do it anonymously at Vent Your Rent. And equally, if you want to be more involved in our policy development, then you can join the Renters Panel. And this is where we regularly get asked by organisations and also government and the civil service to basically, what do renters think about X, Y, and Z? And this is a particular group of people who we go to on a regular basis, who give us their insight and their lived experience of renting, and of course help us campaign. We've been fighting to get the Renters Reform Bill, published. That fight continues. We've been fighting to raise housing benefit levels and raise the benefit cap and help with rent, people who are struggling with rent over this winter. So join our campaigns and help us. And just finally, I just wanted to say, we will send to you the fact sheets, particularly the ones that relate to the theme of this webinar, which is about saving money and dealing with rent increases. We will email you the slides from today so that you have those for reference, and you can click into the links, particularly on Jamie's presentation. And of course, you can view us. We'll send you the links to be able to view this webinar again and again and again. So thank you for your time. We hope you found it useful. The other thing you'll get is a feedback form to tell you whether or not you found it useful and what more information you'd like to see from us. So thank you very much and good night.